All right, Alexander, we have the terrible news of the assassination and the subsequent death, passing away of Shinzo Abe, the former Prime Minister of Japan. He was giving a speech. They're actually campaigning in Japan. I believe the parliament. They're having elections going on, and he was giving a speech in uh, in a town close to Kyoto. I believe the town's name is Nara, if I'm not mistaken.
Mm.
I could be a
Nara,
little Nara.
Nara,
Nara,
yeah,
yeah, okay. And
yeah.
well, anyway, there's video out. It shows the whole thing. It's all over the interwebs. The assassin, he was rushed to a hospital. He was shot in the chest and in the neck. From what I read, he was rushed to a hospital. They couldn't save him. The assassin, from what I read, was a 41-year-old man, and all we know at this moment in time is that he had some sort of beef. He had a dispute with Abe's
Yeah.
policies. I mean, we don't really have much to go on, to be honest. But that's all we
No,
know
no,
anyway.
no, no.
Abe has been assassinated, the former prime minister of Japan. And just a real quick thought before you sound off on this. I don't know much about Japanese politics, and I think a lot of people in the West don't know much about Japanese politics, which is kind of
Yeah.
interesting given how important of a country Japan is and how big of an economy it is. It's very strange that we just don't know much about how the politics in Japan works. But I will say this about Abe, whether you disagree with his policies or not. To me, he was the one Japanese prime minister that broke out into the mainstream. I mean, he became a popular celebrity-like figure. I mean, people knew who he was. Previous prime ministers in Japan, for
Absolutely.
the most part, they kind of came and went. You didn't really know much about them. But Abe became a larger-than-life political figure for Japan. Anyway, those are my thoughts.
Absolutely. He was the most talented politician that Japan has produced for a very, very long time. He dominated the Japanese political scene. He was the longest serving prime minister in Japanese history. I mean, he was there for, what's it, 8 years, which is extraordinary by Japanese standards. And undoubtedly, Japan being Japan, he exercised a huge amount of influence behind the scenes. And, you know, you know, his legacy is disputed. I mean, he tried to increase the speed of Japanese economic growth. There's issues about the extent to which that was successful. I think most people would say that it had only limited success and that in some ways it weakened the financial system. But nonetheless, he was the only prime minister I can think of who actually did seem to have a vision and a plan for Japan beyond, just holding the premiership, running things in a very managerial way. He was much more like, a real politician rather than the sort of rather faceless figures that we see in Japanese life. So a tragedy for him, but also, I think, a huge tragedy for Japan. I mean, Japan, very peaceful, very orderly country, very little gun crime there. And of course, no history over the last decades since the end of the Second World War of assassinations. But it's important to say that has not always been the case. Before the Second World War, political assassinations of prominent political figures, were extremely common in Japan. Mainly, usually, they were carried out by far right groups, which wanted Japan to pursue an even more aggressive foreign policy than it was pursuing at that time. And it all culminated in 1936 in an attempted coup, which was launched by far right units and officers in the Japanese army, which was only brought back under control through the personal intervention of the emperor. And it's widely thought today that that attempted coup, even though it didn't succeed, it didn't overthrow the government. It did do two things. Firstly, it strengthened the position of the emperor. And secondly, and most disastrously, it strengthened the direction of Japan the military direction of Japan, which in 1937, the year after, led to this long, disastrous war against China, and then which eventually led to the Japan becoming involved in the Second World War and this disastrous war with the United States. So Japan has been very stable politically and very peaceful since the war, but that wasn't the case before the war. Now, remember, every member of the Japanese political class is related to someone. This is a very family-oriented system. They're all related to someone who has been in government, in the political system before. Abe, by the way, is no exception. I mean, he's related to very prominent people in Japanese politics. You know, his father, his grandfather, people throughout his family have been important in Japanese politics. And even if they don't remember directly the events of the 20s and 30s, many of them are related. Their family backgrounds relate them back to those events. They know about times of political assassinations and things of that kind. So when we learn that a politician of this prominence has been assassinated by a former soldier who has had political differences with Abe, this is inevitably going to create a shock and a frisson of fear throughout the Japanese political system. And people will be saying to themselves, is this period of peace and stability and prosperity that we've experienced over these last decades, is it now threatened? Is there any danger that we're going to revert back to that nightmare period that we had before the war, which ended in that terrible disaster for Japan? It is inevitable, however unlikely that may seem, it is inevitable that there will be people in Japan worrying and thinking about this because, as I said, many of the prominent politicians are related directly to the politicians of that earlier period. So I don't know whether that's going to happen. Japan looks overall a pretty stable place. I think it will come through this. A lot depends on the motivations and personality of this assassin. But, don't assume that everything is going to be easy or the same again.
Well, will it come through, Alexander? Because the economy is not in the best of states, and I mean this is a terrible tragedy.
Yeah.
For the family of Abe, but for the country as well, and for the psychology of the country, especially now, given the terrible state of the economy.
Indeed, and bear in mind the Japanese economy, was used to once upon a time seemed to be the all-conquering economy. I mean, it's now, it now is apparently, in relative terms, at the same level towards China, which is the great adversary, rival, as Taiwan was in 2000. So, I mean, you can see that Japan has been in relative decline. Its economy has been in relative decline. China is advancing steadily past it, despite China's own problems. And of course, that's making people in Japan very nervous. And there's also a sense that the economic system, in some ways, the economic policies that Abe himself launched are in danger of creating a crisis, an economic crisis in Japan now. So it's by no means certain that it could, that the system will overcome this. I mean, obviously there is the nightmare history of the past. But perhaps there's also another example, which is that back in the 1980s, Olof Palme, who had been the Swedish Prime Minister, was assassinated in Sweden in a very mysterious way, which has never been resolved. And I think many people to this day accept that things began to go very badly wrong in Sweden afterwards, that it created a psychological shock from which Sweden itself has never fully recovered. And the fear must be that the same will happen to Japan now. It's lost its most prominent, its most gifted politician at a time of looming economic crisis, looming geopolitical crisis. Its relationship with Russia, it seems to be progressively breaking down. It's facing the pan-Eurasian colossus of China and Russia coming together. It's got the US distracted and looking increasingly uncertain. So this is not a good time for an assassination like this to happen to Japan.
All right, let's end it there. Let's wait for some more information to come out, especially with regard to the assassin. Maybe we'll learn the motives and the reasons behind this. Do you have any other final thoughts as we wrap up this incredible news day?
I'm going to say something.
Yeah.
A very sad, a tragedy for his family, and as I said, a tragedy for Japan. And just 2 points. Firstly, you're absolutely right. Given Japan's still great economic power and, the sort of heft that Japan has or should have, what happens in Japan really does matter. If Japan goes horribly wrong, then this is going to have an impact right across the world. And just think, if Japanese economy implodes, what that will do to supply chains, for example, on top of all of the other problems we have. Now, I'm not saying that this is directly related to what's happened to Abe, but if there is a deeper malaise in Japan, and if that points to that, and if there's instability in Japan, a country which, by the way, is fully capable of acquiring nuclear weapons in a very short time period, well, this could create a huge new zone of both economic and political instability and insecurity at a time when, we already have far too many. And as somebody who, by the way, greatly admires Japanese culture, this is a great blow for the Japanese people. And, I have to say that one is deeply affected by this, both for Mr. Abe's family and for the entire Japanese nation.
All right. We will leave it there. TheDuran.locals.com, everybody. Take care.